In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Calvin's institutes and the way that they shaped not only Calvin's ministry and life, but also their importance. But above all, we're going to look at how the institutes fit within the world of the Reformation itself and how it ushered in Calvin as one of the leading theologians of the first generation of the Reformation. And we're going to be brief on this. We're not going to be overly long. But the institutes really deserve our attention because by the completion of their final edition in 1559, the institutes were really an opus, really a phenomenal piece of work that would go down in history as one of the greatest productions of a Protestant in the entirety of the 16th century. By the time they were translated into English and into French and other languages, they quickly took on a new importance amongst reform-minded folks throughout Europe. And in a manner of speaking, that's really where Calvin's influence comes from, his writing. We've noted a few times that Luther's influence in particular is drawn heavily from the dynamism of his personality and the real rigorous commitment to the doctrine of justification by faith. Other doctrines of Luther's, for those who are not Lutheran, tends to sit quite lightly with people, meaning not everyone likes Luther's view of the sacraments or his view of the law or at times his view of other matters. But Luther is always in the lead role as the principal Protestant reformer. Calvin's writings and his ministry, by contrast, form a different type of engagement with the later world or the heritage of the Reformation going on after their death. As Calvin's institutes begin to be used, people increasingly find it useful and helpful and clear in an attempt to understand the theology of the Reformation. And in particular, as Latin becomes less and less familiar for folks, the other vitally important books from the Reformation at times get left on the shelf. Many of us, frankly, would be unaware of Bullinger's Decades or of Melanchthon's Loci or the works of Butzer or Peter Martyr or any of these folks. But just about everyone has heard of the institutes at some point. So that's to tell us something about their importance. In some ways, Calvin's contribution to the Reformed tradition was so large that it was only natural for some to begin calling themselves Calvinists. Though, of course, as we've seen, they don't do this for some time, centuries really. But just because we want to put Calvin in his context does not mean that we want to lessen or reduce the influence of Calvin's institutes, in particular in the English-speaking worlds. Well, how do the institutes come about? Well, the first edition of the institutes was in 1536. It was actually quite a short work, just 6 chapters. In understanding why Calvin wrote this and the sources that he's using are important. Calvin, of course, was a lawyer. He was a humanist. He was not trained in theology or in the classic works of systematics or of the church fathers themselves. Or at least, in some respects, Calvin was an amateur, you might say. He certainly didn't have the scholastic theological training that Luther had. But the 1536 Institutes serve a purpose, and they have a context, and we are pretty certain of which books Calvin is using as he is crafting the structure of the book itself. And this is important to realize. At times, Calvin will use the structure provided by other books by Melanchthon or Zwingli or others. And he'll craft this structure, and then within it, he'll write his own articulation of the various doctrines. Well, in 1536, it seems very clear that Calvin is basing the relatively simple structure of it off of primarily the works of Luther. There are a couple in particular, we're not going to go into all the details, but Calvin is actually using Luther's structure. Now, he's not ripping him off. He's not using all of his theology itself. Calvin is always going to be an independent writer and an independent thinker. But the structure is Lutheran. Now, what most people miss, in fact, it's really not talked about much in secondary sources, is the question of why would he use Luther? Well, for new students to the subject, they're usually a bit confused. they tend to see Calvin as a ready-made antagonist to some of Luther's doctrines. Well, he's not. At this point, he is actually very appreciative of Luther. And in fact, throughout the remainder of his career, all the way until his death, Calvin will have enormously high praise for Luther, though at times he will be pretty open and sharp about his criticisms of some of the doctrines that Luther taught. Well, why would he use Luther? Why would he attempt to structure the Institutes in this way? Well, the answer comes from the preface. And the preface, even down until today in the 1559 edition, has the same preface. The preface is written to Francis I. Well, you'll recall in our lecture on Calvin's conversion and exile that Francis had churned on the Reformed or Protestant-minded humanists throughout France. The affair of the placards and a number of other things had propelled Francis to really churn against those in the context of France that were taking their reform-minded humanism a bit too far. Well, what Francis was doing, if we remember the context, is he wants to be the gadfly. He wants to be the nuisance, the mortal enemy to Charles. And all throughout the 1530s, Charles is attempting to tamp down and eventually to suppress fully Lutheranism. Now, he's not able to, and Lutheranism relatively thrives. But you'll also remember that the 1530s is the time when the Schmalkaldic League is getting underway, and there is now a political muscle behind Lutheranism. At one point, actually in the 1530s, Francis agreed to partner and to join the Schmalkaldic League, which is a bit funny given Francis's anti-Protestant stance within his own country. But again, whatever he can do to hack Charles off will make him just happy. And Francis does eventually pull out of any negotiations to join the Schmalkaldic League, due in large part to the fact that it was so overwhelmingly Protestant. Well, what's going on in this day, both in Germany and in France, is that because of the political muscle of Lutheranism, and because of Luther's really harsh rejection of Zwingli in 1531, the political entities, whenever they refer to Protestants, almost always have in mind Lutherans. And by and large, they also took Luther's position that the Reformed perspective, the Swiss perspective of people like Zwingli, etc., was fundamentally Schwammer or Anabaptist or part of the more radical Reformation. Well, not surprisingly, when Francis churns and begins to reject the reform-minded humanists within France, one of the real leverage points that is being worked out here is a sort of broad brush that is being painted across all of these humanists who are now fleeing for Protestant lands as being Anabaptist. That is to say, there is an attempt to describe them as millenarian or apocalyptic, as the same kind of folks that enacted the Peasants' Revolt. In the 1530s, there was also another Anabaptist revolution in the area of Munster, which is a city up in the northwestern part of Germany that at one point had an Anabaptist takeover, and all kinds of crazy things happened. Forced polygamy, the eradication of private property, and eventually, one of the leaders of this group rode out with an undermanned army, believing that he had heard from the Holy Spirit that he was going to be a new Gideon, and he got cut down, and the city was eventually restored. Well, all these ideas are always swirling in Europe at this time. To be Anabaptist was to be treasonous, terrorist, usurper, crazy. All of these things are in play here when we're talking about Anabaptist. Well, what's going on here is the Lutheran line about Zwingli is being applied to a number of different folks throughout the Swiss regions, and these Frenchmen who have fled to the Swiss regions are now being accused of the same thing. So, when you look at Calvin's first edition of the Institutes, the overwhelming, if not the only reason for its publication, is simply the fact that Calvin is saying, we are not Anabaptist. The opening letter is pretty extensive and argues very conclusively, Calvin thinks, that what the French Protestants now believe is not all that different from what Luther himself believed. Now it might make sense why he used Luther's works in order to arrange the Institutes in 1536. It also explains one of the more curious things when people first read the 1536 Institutes, or they look at the table of contents perhaps, is that it doesn't really follow any theological or catechesis structure. In other words, after having fled from France, sitting back saying, you know what would be a good theology book? Something called the Institutes. And then he doesn't apply himself to simply write a systematic theology. Rather, the 1536 edition is born of the context of these Frenchmen attempting to let their countrymen know, and in particular, to let Francis I know, that they are not raving lunatics, but that their theology comports with the vast majority of Luther's message itself. In other words, the Institutes begin more out of a concern for France, more out of a concern for his countrymen, more as an apology, you might say, in terms of apologetics, in the hope that Francis will hear him and will put an end to the persecutions in his homeland. Well, then, if that's the context and the impetus behind the 1536 edition of the Institutes, how then do we get to this massive 2-volume thing that we have now in the modern English printing of it? Well, the answer is that Calvin changed his mind as to how he wanted to use the book. Maybe this is the lawyer in him. Maybe this is just simply the idiosyncrasies of Calvin himself. But there's actually a clue as to what Calvin is doing, not in the person of Luther, but in the person of Melanchthon. You'll recall from our lectures on Lutheranism that Melanchthon was really the systematizer of the Lutheran perspective on a number of subjects. And we commented how Melanchthon in 1521 wrote the Loci Communes, which really is a Lutheran version of the Institutes. And just like the Institutes, there was an early edition of the Loci Communes that Melanchthon wrote, and he expanded it. Well, what recent scholars have pointed out is that Melanchthon in the early to mid 1530s is really publishing at a pretty high rate. He publishes a significant commentary on Romans, and, more importantly, just prior to the 1536 Institutes, Melanchthon publishes the second edition of his Loci. And just like the Institutes, Melanchthon has expanded it, he has added sections, he has developed and matured the vocabulary within it. Well, again, recent scholars have actually pointed out that this has a pretty significant impact on Calvin. In 1539, Calvin published a second edition of the Institutes. Now, he publishes this while in his exile to Strasbourg, which we'll cover in one of our later lectures. Calvin had failed pretty miserably in Geneva in his first attempt. Let that be a lesson to all you pastors. Sometimes even failure is okay. Learn your lessons and move on. Well, once Calvin had been exiled from Geneva, and he had landed in Strasbourg with Butzer, and he began to have significantly more free time to work on his book, suddenly in 1539, he comes up with another edition of the book. This time, there are 17 chapters, and more importantly, there is a rearrangement of the order of the subjects that has been the subject of some debate, which we're not going to really go into now, but we need to understand that what's going on here is something significant. The Institutes in 1539 begin a long process where they move from a really sort of period piece, where Calvin is focused on defending himself and his brethren as not being Anabaptist, to now becoming something that is more of a catechism or a resource for anyone who wants to discuss theological topics in general. Now, you have to be careful here. The rise in the 19th and 20th centuries of these massive systematic theologies, things like Barth's church dogmatics, has somewhat prejudiced us to believe that what Calvin's doing is something like that he's trying to sort of summarize every teaching on the doctrine, or he's trying to convey what he believes is his unique perspective on a number of different topics. Well, that's just simply not what Calvin's doing. The fact that we see it that way is really more of a result of the fact that we're unaware of what's going on around Calvin at this time. Well, in the 1539 edition, Calvin begins a wrestling process, you might say, where he tries to determine what is the best order to discuss theological topics. And if you stop and think about it, it's actually a pretty profound question. How do you start to talk about the faith, particularly for people who are brand new to the faith, which in Calvin's day was just about everybody in terms of Protestant theology? Well, there were two strategies that were being proposed at this time by a vast number of Protestants, but in particular, Melanchthon and Calvin are really thinking deeply about the ways Christians approach their faith. Because in general, there are two perspectives, they thought. The first is you can approach the topic through the structure of the creed. That is to say, you begin with God the Father, and you discuss topics related to that. You then move to the doctrine of the Son, which of course brings in all the doctrines of the cross and salvation. And then you talk about the doctrine of the Spirit, which is of the Christian life and the church, etc. And if you look at the institutes, from 1539 to 1559, they actually develop increasingly towards that structure. Now, people sometimes scratch their head about that because they say, wait, the creed is Trinitarian, but the institutes have 4 books. How in the world is this based on the Apostles' Creed? Well, the answer is found later in Calvin's ministry in the 1540s, where he writes that the creed has a 4-part structure, he believes. God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit, and he said the 4th locus was the church. Now, notice Calvin did not say Christian living. Calvin is pretty committed to a negative posture of individualism. For him, the Christian life is in the church. It's the collective life we have together, the koinonia we have together. Well, put that aside. What we're looking at now is Calvin really trying to make the structure of the institutes creedal. And for a lot of people, that makes sense. Follow the creed. The Apostles' Creed has a simple structure, and go through it. Well, the problem is that's not how we learn our faith as Christians. We learn our faith, Melanchthon and Calvin and others will say, really in the middle of the entire story. And Melanchthon in particular writes about this, and it does seem to have an impact on Calvin. Melanchthon and Luther and Calvin and others, when they looked for a way that Christians should engage their faith, they were sensitive to the fact that probably a better way, a better method, you might say, of discussing our faith is to use the book of Romans as our guide. Now, again, they're not saying the book of Romans is systematic theology, but what they are saying is that the narrative structure that Paul gives us in Romans, they believe might be better for Christians in terms of the evolution and the development of the doctrinal subjects related to all of the scriptural teachings. Well, just think about it. Romans begins, first off, with sin. Begins with the lack of the ability of all of humanity to save itself or to choose God. It then proceeds through the doctrines of salvation. Predestination actually comes after the discussion of justification by faith, which only makes sense because what Paul is saying is you were lost, you were dead in sin, then you were justified, you came to saving faith, and now, in the midst of saving faith, there are all these other realities that were at work and at play in your life all the way back to eternity past. God's election, the structure of the Christian life, all the section of Romans going after the doctrine of justification is, at least in terms of the order of quote-unquote systematic theology, all out of order. Well, Melanchthon and Calvin in particular believe that Romans is more of how we, to use a modern word, existentially appropriate and come to knowledge of what our faith is. We were lost, then we were found, and everything else comes as a result of that. Well, the work of Richard Muller in particular on this issue has really driven home the fact that Melanchthon's teachings on these issues, though not embraced by Calvin entirely, are nevertheless taken over. And Calvin spends from 1539 to 1559, from the first major revision of the Institutes all the way to their end, really wrestling with how to approach a creedal formula or a creedal structure of the Institutes and yet also take into account the fact that that is not how we approach our faith existentially or personally. That, in fact, we approach the subject of our faith only after justification is experienced in the life of the believer. Not to put too fine a point on this, but really what's going on here is the kind of thing you would see debated today whenever people are debating the difference between biblical theology and systematic theology. But we have to be careful here because Calvin is not, in the modern sense of the word, a systematician. He is not attempting to say everything about everything. He is not attempting to answer all the questions of the Christian life. All the way until their final publication, Calvin is adamant. The Institutes are to stand as a book that is a reference source for Christians of all kinds, but in particular, those who were training for pastoral ministry, but that they were only a guide to the overall sweep of Protestant theology, but that they were insufficient on their own. Calvin will stress repeatedly that biblical commentary, biblical exegesis, is the primary place for understanding our theology. Calvin will drive this home pretty significantly. A systematic or a more catechesis structure of the Institutes, of the way that we approach our faith, is required. It's necessary. It's discipleship. You ask questions like, who is Jesus? And you have to sum up the faith. And a creedal structure to the Institutes made sense to Calvin. But Calvin was very keen to say, stick to the scriptures. Go to the exegesis there. And the Institutes form kind of a later secondary order of the consideration of the faith. When someone says, what does this text mean? You exegete that text, Calvin will say. But when someone says, what does this text mean in the context of everything the Bible teaches? Well, in that case, you need, Calvin believes, something like the Institutes as a reference source, not as a dictionary or an encyclopedia, not in that sense of a reference, but a source or a place where you can go and really engage with a more comprehensive look at the overall sweep of certain doctrines. In the end, the 1559 edition of the Institutes, Calvin believes, and he tells us actually this in a new preface that he writes for the 1559 edition, that finally, he says, he feels that he's come to a proper ordering of things. Now, historians, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, have gotten this so wrong. And it's not because they're dumb, it's because they were contextual people as well. The 19th and 20th centuries loved abstract systematic theology, more Enlightenment-focused systematic theology. They also were enamored by something that they called the central dogma thesis, which is this idea that everybody has one core dogma or one core doctrine that drives everything else. And it's no wonder that Calvin's doctrine of, quote, predestination or something else always comes to the foreground as the one thing Calvin really cares about above all else. Well, that idea of a central dogma has been exploded by historians over the last 2 or 3 generations. But when Calvin says that he feels that the structure is finally in place in 1559, what he means by that is that he finally believes that he's found a balance between catechesis or creedal appropriations of our theology that goes through the structures in terms of God, Father, Son, and Church, but that he also believes that in the end he has taken into account the more organic way that we come to the discussion of our faith, namely as a post-justification reality existentially for us. And so people have noticed, you read through the Institutes, it looks like it's following the Apostles' Creed at times, until some stray doctrine seems to show up in one book or the other. And what Calvin is usually doing in those cases is he's not waiting for some opportune moment that the Apostles' Creed brings something up to talk about something, but rather in the context of relying on the order or the method of Romans, of biblical theology. Calvin will stop at times and feel the need to explain implications of doctrines or ideas or biblical teaching as they arise from the more organic, natural flow of the narrative of Scripture itself. And so in 1559, Calvin believed that he had achieved enough of a balance that he was finally happy with the Institutes. Well, in the end, the Institutes are profound. They're in various Latin translations. Calvin himself personally oversaw the translation of the Institutes into French. And in fact, the institutes themselves, once they were translated, were instrumental, one of the core developers of what would become modern French as it transitions out of the early modern or the late medieval dialects of French. So influential were Calvin's institutes that they even shaped the language. And, not surprisingly, in the English-speaking world, after they were translated just after Calvin's lifetime, they have come down all the way till today as one of the most important texts of the Reformation. Okay, that's it. Next, we're going to be looking at Calvin in Geneva as a pastor, how he screwed it up and got himself kicked out and threatened with death.